I think it's safe to say that a lot of us were expecting something from Breath of the Wild 2 by now. The things people wanted ranged from unrealistic hopes for a midnight shadow drop during the Game Awards to more reasonable hopes for another trailer and maybe a release date. I personally just expected some sort of acknowledgement of it by now, and while we did technically get an acknowledgement via its inclusion in the 2022 Game Awards sizzle reel, mostly we were just left with silence and a lot of questions about the game. That is, until the delay. I did warn people not to get their expectations too high in regards to the Game Awards. People put far too much stock into supposed leaks pushed by leakers with histories of just as many false predictions as ones that they got right, and they buy into hype pushed by large channels for clicks. Then, when they don't get what they want, they act like Nintendo personally lied to them instead of being upset with their sources or analyzing what caused them to place so much assurance on events like the Game Awards. And while the delay did not surprise me whatsoever, there were a lot of people who voiced skepticism and even ridicule at the very notion of a delay. Nevertheless, this is the situation we find ourselves in, and it's resulted in a lot of people asking one question that I've heard non-stop over the last year. Why is Breath of the Wild 2 taking so long? There's a lot of frustration around the long development time Breath of the Wild 2 seems to be experiencing, and a lot of people are becoming exasperated and even frustrated over it. So I thought we'd talk about that today. Take a look at the reasons why Breath of the Wild 2 is taking so long, and explore whether this long development time really is unreasonable or to be expected. Before we get into it, I just want to add that if you like these kinds of videos and you want to show some support, you can do so by liking and commenting on the video and subscribing if you haven't. In addition, I have a Patreon if you'd like to show some more direct support, and pledging $1 lets you design a Subrosian for the Subrosian Parade, which you should see marching across the screen as we speak. Thanks to everybody who's pledged. So as we know, we saw the trailer for Breath of the Wild 2 in Nintendo's 2019 E3 presentation, alongside a couple interviews that gave us a bit of information. Then came a long wait, as the next time we got news was in the February Direct in 2021, where Aonuma told us that production was going smoothly and to expect more news later in the year. Sure enough, that summer, during Nintendo's E3, we finally got some more substantial news, seeing another trailer that clarified how Breath of the Wild 2 would be different from the first. We also got a release year, a tentative 2022. Notably, we didn't get a title, since according to Bill Trinan, the title would give away too much of the story. Then after the trailer, we got nothing. The leaves fell as summer gave way to autumn and then winter, and the holidays came and passed with no Breath of the Wild 2 news, not even at the Game Awards. Then finally, on the 29th of March, we get news of a delay. On one hand, it does suck that it was delayed, but on the other hand, at least we have a solid release date of spring 2023 now. I do sympathize with the frustration a lot of people feel about the long development and now the delay, but honestly this wait isn't that unexpected. I've often seen people decry the fact that this is the longest wait between Zelda games. After all, Breath of the Wild was released in March 2017 and it's been 5 years since then. 5 years, that's crazy, right? Well, not really. I honestly think that this take comes mostly from people who are newer fans getting into the Zelda series through Breath of the Wild and haven't been around for previous games. Because the truth is that while 5 years is definitely a long time, it's honestly about average for Zelda games and not even the longest we've had to wait. Let's take a look at the gaps between mainline games. We're going to discount spin-off titles and handheld games, since I doubt a new handheld style game would have satiated most of the people who are bothered by Breath of the Wild 2's long development time. Legend of Zelda for the NES came out in February of 1986, and Zelda 2 came out in January 1987. So a year apart. That makes sense, they're both NES games. A Link to the Past, the first Zelda game with some meat to it, came out in November 1991, almost 5 years later. Ocarina of Time followed in November of 1998, a whopping 7 years later. Majora's Mask came out about a year and a half later and was famously rushed to such a degree that it basically gave Aonuma PTSD. Then we got Wind Waker nearly 3 years later. Twilight Princess followed just under 4 years later. Then the time between Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword was another big one at 5 years. That was followed by the biggest current gap between 3D releases between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild at 5 years and 5 months. Even considering the current 5-year gap, we can still see that Breath of the Wild 2 is by no means an exception. A Link to the Past, Skyward Sword, and Breath of the Wild all took 5 years of development time from the last console Zelda game, and Ocarina of Time took a whopping 7 years to come out from the last console releases. Even if we counted handheld entries, Ocarina of Time still took 5 years from the release of Link's Awakening. So the idea that Breath of the Wild 2 is taking the longest of any Zelda game to release is overstating things. If it does avoid any further delays and comes out in spring 2023, the gap between A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time will have still been longer. If you don't count that gap because of Link's Awakening coming out in between, well, Breath of the Wild 2 will be the longest wait, but only by about half a year, as the first Breath of the Wild took, as we said, about 5.5 years to come out from Skyward Sword. We also need to talk about the elephant in the room and address the pandemic. Think about it. Most of the 3D Zelda games took 4 or 5, even 6 to 7 years to develop under completely unencumbered conditions. At their full capacity with nothing opposing them, Twilight Princess still took 4 years and Skyward Sword still took 5 years. Breath of the Wild 1 still took 5.5 years. But Breath of the Wild 2 isn't being developed under normal conditions. It very well might have started off in normal conditions, but the majority of the game's development has been done under the shadow of the pandemic. We know that most of the Japanese tech industry is at a really difficult time adapting to working online, and we know that this is absolutely true for Nintendo as well. We know that the switch to working from home is probably the reason for Nintendo canceling their 2020 June Direct, and in their 2020 end-of-year fiscal report, they directly cite COVID as a cause for delay in their research and development. It's absolutely no secret that COVID hit every developer hard, and Nintendo is absolutely no different in this regard. So if anything, I actually think it's a bit of a miracle that Breath of the Wild 2 is only set to take about a half year longer than previous development times. Despite being a game almost entirely developed during a pandemic and in a brand new work environment, Breath of the Wild 2 is still slated to take only a bit longer than an average 3D Zelda game. That's pretty astonishing to me, and if it does end up releasing in spring 2023, I think the Zelda team deserves a lot of credit for that. Of course, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, and that they'll disagree with me because of the other most common argument I hear. That Breath of the Wild 2 should have a quick development because it's a sequel using the same engine as the first game. The argument goes, hey, since the game is being made in the same engine and with the same overworld, shouldn't it take way less time? Isn't that the whole reason they wanted to make another game in the same setting? And to address that second point, no. Nowhere in the interview did Aonuma ever mention wanting to reuse the engine to save time. He said that he felt like it would be a waste for them to just move on and that there was more that they could do with it. If they were looking to just make a quick buck reusing the same assets, we'd be getting a Link's crossbow training sequel with a Breath of the Wild reskin. It's very obvious that they wanted to make a full-fledged new game. I think a lot of people may have been under the impression that Breath of the Wild 2 was going to be a sort of half game, or like a really big DLC type experience, an expansion pack to use a dated millennial term, something equivalent to The Witcher's Blood and Wine DLC, or the Elder Scrolls Oblivion's Shivering Isles. To me, it's always been clear that they weren't just planning to make a Breath of the Wild sequel, but that this was going to be the next mainline Zelda game, with all the effort that entails. But still, with the world already made for them and a lot of the assets already done, the mechanics largely already coded, shouldn't the game still take a bit less time? Well, yeah, I think in a non-COVID world it probably would have come out last year, but I don't think it would have ever been a quick release, likely still a 3 to 4 year development time. Because like I said, I don't think they ever treated this as just a sequel, using it as an excuse to go easy. I think they always thought of this game as the next mainline Zelda, which means that while the core mechanics are already finished, they're probably developing a new game's worth of new mechanics to add to it. And I think the things that Aonuma said during the delay announcement back this up. He says that the game will have an even wider variety of features you can enjoy, including new encounters and gameplay elements. The way that a lot of people describe what they thought Breath of the Wild 2 was going to be is kind of concerning. A lot of people seem to think that the game was just going to be the exact same overworld with another bare bones story, but with some floating islands now. Basically another version of the original game, but with slight differences. More equivalent to a new Fortnite season than to an entirely new game. In fact, the way I see some people respond to suggested changes or additions as moving too far away from the original game makes me think this is what people wanted. And not only is that extremely confusing to me, but I don't think there was ever a chance that the Zelda team wanted to do anything like that. Like, why would you want something like that? Do you really want Legend of Zelda to become a game series that gets frequent releases, but with imperceptible changes in quality between them? I have no desire for Legend of Zelda to become like Call of Duty or even Pokemon. 3 to 5 or 6 years for a new game is a long wait for sure, but look at the quality and effort that goes into every new mainline release. Has there ever been a Zelda game that's felt half-assed? I don't think so. My least favorite 3D Zelda game is Twilight Princess, but it still had a gargantuan amount of effort put into it. Even the most unpopular 3D game, Skyward Sword, clearly had effort put into it, even if you don't enjoy the areas where the effort was applied. Half-assed isn't a word that I think I have ever or will ever apply to a Zelda series, at least in the mainline games. Even Triforce Heroes, which I think is probably the lowest effort mainline game, still had a lot of love and affection put into it, even if the core systems are bad. So I don't think there was ever a universe where Nintendo planned on releasing a game that was basically Breath of the Wild with a slightly new coat of paint. This is the reason why I think that the game is taking so long. It's because the Zelda team didn't use the fact that the engine and mechanics are already done as an excuse to take it easy. Rather, they're using it as an excuse to add enough new content and change the overworld enough that it isn't just a Breath of the Wild sequel, it's the next Zelda game. And there is some precedent for this. Look at the DS games. Regardless of whether you like them or not, the DS games show pretty clearly that Nintendo doesn't like to just take it easy. Spirit Tracks use the same engine and art style as Phantom Hourglass, and even some of the same assets, but they use them to develop an entirely new game. And while that obviously won't be the case with Breath of the Wild 2, we are getting the same overworld. I think it does serve as proof that the Zelda team has never really had an interest in just coasting by on pre-made assets. The DS entries, of all things, is the one area where they probably could have gotten away with half-assing it, but they didn't. Not only did they develop an entirely new setting for each, but they also developed new core mechanics. And this just occurred to me, but look at Age of Calamity. Obviously that wasn't developed by Nintendo, but it was made in conjunction with them, and that game is getting in trouble for being too original and not sticking to what people expected enough. You know, now that I think about it, I think people were expecting Breath of the Wild 2 to be more similar to A Link Between Worlds, with the overworld being the same but the content being different. But I don't think that was ever the case. A Link Between Worlds was a pseudo remake, whereas Breath of the Wild 2 is a whole new game. Who knows, maybe I'll be totally wrong, and when Breath of the Wild 2 releases, it'll be only incrementally different, and the long time really will not be justified. But I don't think that'll be the case. I have a lot of issues with a lot of different aspects and parts of Nintendo, but I've never doubted or had issue with the Zelda team. I think they're magnificent, and they always have been. I think that Aonuma and Fujibayashi are an absolute dream team, and the franchise has never been in better hands. The idea that they were ever going to put out a low effort or even medium effort sequel had never even occurred to me until people mentioned it, and I will never have any notion of where they got that idea from. Maybe other Nintendo development studios, but I think that the Zelda team has always marched to the beat of their own drum, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Mark my words, when we finally do get our substantial look at Breath of the Wild 2, probably this E3, I think it'll be obvious why the development time was so long. Not just because of the pandemic, which was undoubtedly a major factor, but it's also going to be a sequel worthy of one of the most important games of the modern age. Thanks for watching.